Hi everyone. For this lecture, we're going to be looking at user input and error handling and a few different concepts that we can review from 241 as well. So to get started, what we can do here is I'm going to try to make some functions, and essentially this function is going to run a certain amount of times, ask the user to input something, compare it to some questions, and then output an answer. So inside of your Python files, there's an adding game tutor.py file that does something similar to this, but I'm going to build this out incrementally so we can see all the logic and inner workings of it. So as similar to 241, the way that you create a function in Python is you start out with this keyword called def. If you're using Swift, it's called func. Java has a different way of using it as well with like a public void. And for Python, it's very easy to create a function because all you need to do is after you put def is say my function. Now, you'll notice that every time we create a function in Python, we have to provide these two parentheses followed by a colon. Now, why do we need a colon here? Well, Python uses whitespace to delineate how code will run and the scope of your code. And these two parentheses here are your parameters. So if you have these empty, essentially what will happen here, and let me use pass one more time. Pass is that thing that happens where if I don't have it in there, I get an error. So I'm going to put pass. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to call my function by saying my function, and then I'm going to put in my two parentheses here. What happens if I don't put in my two parentheses? This will run, but what you're actually getting is the memory address of where this is located. So to show you this, if I type in my function like this, I run it, you'll see that this is actually the memory location of where this function is stored. If I add in my two parentheses here, instead of calling the memory address, I get the the actual function run, and we'll see that this says none because we're not doing anything inside of here. We're returning a none type. What I want to do is let me just print hello like so. We'll see here now I get a hello. Cool. Now you'll notice that it's actually printing out none after I say print my function. Now it's not. Essentially, if your function doesn't return anything without using the return keyword like this, it technically returns a none type. So a none type means null or nothing inside of our code. And every time your function doesn't do anything to return something, you will get that return type. Cool. So now what does this parenthesis list meaning? Well, what I could say up here is I could say like param1 and param2. And what this means is that I'm going to have these parameters work up here. Now, why does this matter if I run it? You'll notice here I get this error, type error, my function missing two required positional arguments, param1 and param2. Essentially, if you add parameters up here, you're going to need to put something down here for them to work with. So for our game here, I'm going to put it in as 5 and 5. What I could say now is I could say something like param1 plus param2. And we'll see I get 10 because what I'm doing is I'm adding these two values here. One more thing I want to briefly cover is if you go to the options of your idle, I'll do this because this might be a bit smaller to see on your end. You could change your size of your code, and you can also change the theme as well of it. So if you go to, I believe, highlights over here, you can use like idle dark or idle classic. For them, I'm going to use dark just because the what hurts my eyes. So you can see here that now it's a bit larger. So if you wanted the dark theme or anything, it's in options. What I want to do next though is let's try to go ahead and try to make this code a bit more neat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete param2. What I want to do is I want to essentially run a game as many times as n. So the user is going to put in n and it's going to run something n times. So what I could do for that is I could say for I in n, and what I'll do here is I'm going to print I because I want to showcase what this does for us. Oops. And what I'll say here is you'll notice that when I said I in n, this means that it's going to try to iterate over n, but I don't want it to iterate over n. What I want it to iterate over is the length of n. Or sorry, for the range of n, because n isn't a sizable object. So now we'll see that if n is 5, I get to go from 0 up to 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is technically 5 times. So now essentially I have my code run 5 times if the user puts in 5. Now, what do I want to do this here? What I want my code to do, whenever the user puts in a function, I'm going to try to ask them to guess the randomness between two answers. So I'm going to go ahead and import this random module. You might have seen this earlier. Now, don't worry about trying to memorize how all the modules are imported. All you need to worry about is making sure that you're referencing the code correctly for them. What I'll do right now is in my function, I'm going to say x is equal to randint of 0 and 9. So this is going to pick a random number between 0 and 9. And I'm going to do that twice. And I believe this is a lowercase I. Cool. Now to go ahead and try to see if this is working, I'm going to print x and y. And you'll notice that each time I do this, I get the random values that are here. Now, right now, 0 and 9 is a large scale to kind of pick between. So what I'm going to do is the 0 and 2. So right now I have a few lower values to pick from just because our guessing game is going to be a bit more tough with larger numbers. And what I want to do next is I want to tell the user to input the number that is the answer. So I'm going to create a variable called answer. And what I'm going to say to the user is I'm going to say, hey, try to guess what the answer is, essentially. Try to guess the answer. So how do I actually get user input? Well, what you could say here is I'm going to make a variable called user input. And the keyword for input is actually just input 1. So I'm going to say, please guess the answer, like so. And we'll notice here that what I'm going to try to do is if I type in 5, you'll notice that my prompt gets put up right away, and I can type in variables here. And it looks like my code is running okay because I can guess it 5 times. So this is good. Now, what's an issue with this here? Why don't we actually try to print out the type of user input? And as a general hint, whenever you're coding and you're stuck, please use print statements. Of course, it's always okay to ask questions and everything, but the more print statements you use and the more you debug your code, the more effective it will be on your end to realize what's going on. And what I mean by this is that if I type in 4 and tree, you'll notice that the string class is what this actually is. So the type of user input is actually a string. And why is that an issue? Well, let's just say that the answer was 5. And I say 5 is equal to the string of 5, we'll actually get a false. So what's happening here is that instead of getting what we expect to be a true, we'll get a false. So how do I actually solve this? What we can do here is use this eval around our input. And what eval will do when we put it around our input is essentially evaluate the type of user input that is used for us and then attribute it to the string. So what I could say here is 5 is going to be a class int. And if I type in a string like true, it's going to be a string. We'll see that one is bool, and you're going to get an unexpected error. If you just type in a string normally like test, what this actually means is that this is going to think that this is a function, and it's going to try to do something with it. And we'll notice that we get a name error. So we're seeing right here that we get a name error, and this essentially is an issue for us to work with, right? So what needs to happen is how do we catch this name error? How do we catch the user from not entering this in? What we could do here is whenever we have a type of function that we want to make sure runs properly, we'll surround it with a try and except. So a try and except essentially means try to do something in our code. And what we're going to try to do is guess the value. If this doesn't work for any reason, if this try breaks whatever way, except what we could say here is error, like so. So now what I can try to do inside of my code is if I run this again, and I put in a 5, we'll notice that our code is working fine. If I put in test, it's working fine. This time when I put in test again, I'm actually getting the string of error. So inside of your code for your files, you're asked on your assignment to go ahead and check for errors when you're reading in files and using these functions. This is essentially how you would do these errors. Now we'll notice that we got a special error called name errors. So what happens with this name error? What you can actually do is you can make multiple accepts. So what you could say here, accept name error, print, please do not enter text without quotes. So now we'll see here, I'm going to change this to other error. And if I try to run this code and I put in a 5, it works just fine. If I put in a string of tests, that's working fine too. And now if I put in an actual blank test here, we'll see that instead of going to this error, that's other error, we get please not enter string without text. Now if I try maybe something like this, we'll see now that when I put in something really random, we'll get other error. So now I'm getting two different errors. So there's a lot of other errors you can see. And now you might be wondering, well, how do I figure out which errors to use? You just need to read the error code that you get, right? So if I go ahead, let me, one more thing is that if you press Alt-Tree on your keyboard, that comments out blocks. Alt-4 uncomments it. You can go up to Options, or excuse me, Edit. Where is it? Oh, excuse me, Format. If you go up to Format, there's Comment Out Region and Uncomment Region. And what that does for us is just essentially highlight it out for us. What we could do now with this snippet of code is let's try it one more time. And now if I try to do the test like we did earlier, we'll notice that I'm getting the name error. So that's where I got name error from. Cool. So now we have a few more complicated answers that are going on with us. We'll see here that I have to try and accept's working okay. And what I want to do now is after I do all this try, I'm going to try to actually check if the answer is correct. So I'm going to say if user input is equal to answer, I'll print you got the answer correct, like so. And then otherwise, I'm going to say print close but not correct, like so. Now, one more thing that I would like to do is after we go ahead and finish up our game, I want to actually output to the user how many times they got it correct. So if you're ever doing something in your code where you need to keep a counter of something, what you need is a variable of count. So it doesn't have to be called count. It could be whatever it is, like correct count or counter variable. But essentially, every time I hit this if statement where it says, okay, user input is equal to answer, I'm going to say correct count plus equals 1. And what this does for us is it increments it up by 1. This is a very short-term way of saying correct count is equal to correct count plus 1. It's a lot easier to do it this way. And now what I want to do is I'm just going to, for the time being, print correct count, like so. Cool. So it looks like tree got me the answer correct. And it looks like I got it wrong that time there. Let me do one more thing where I'm going to remove the print of type. Let me also just make this a little bit. Oops. Okay. So that we can see more of the console. We'll see here if I put tree. It looks like okay, that's not a good one. Let me try to use a few different variables there. Cool. So I got one correct. And we'll notice here at the very end, if you're kind of playing a game, you'll see that we get a 1, and that's not very useful for us, right? Like, what does this mean? So what I want to showcase for our last little snippet here is how this correct count actually works. And essentially what's happening here is we can use a format of a string to showcase how you can make text really readable for us. And what we mean by that is if you print out a string, you could say something like, you got... And what I want to do essentially is how do I use variables in association with a string? This is called formatted string or inline formatting of a string. Whenever you want to put variables inside of a string, instead of using string concatenation, where you could technically go like this, where you say plus the string of correct count, but an easier way to do this is by using these two curly brackets, the ones that you use to declare a set or a dictionary, and you just type out your string. And after you do that, you can put a whatever you'd like after here. Essentially, you're going to put in a string that says you got variable location correct out of variable placeholder, not location, excuse me. So these are placeholders for variables. And what you could say here is after your string, you can put a dot format. And you'll notice that I have this little pop-up that tells me format again. And what we can put in here are the type of variables that should go here. So essentially, I'm going to have correct count. And that's going to be that variable that gets incremented during my for loop. And how do I access how many total variables I had? Well, my n is up there, right? So my n was a parameter that was given to me. So I can actually answer it down here again. And what I can do now is if I run this, I can put a tree to, looks like I got 1 correct. Close but not correct. And we'll see here, you got 1 correct out of 5. So again, and then again, if I swap these two, the n would be here and the correct count would be there. Cool. So everyone, the try and accept is something that I really wanted to focus on. That's one that's important. So please experiment around with that. The for loop and the while loops and the break statements are pretty straightforward once you see them again. As a reminder, a break statement essentially breaks out of a loop wherever we are. So right here, if I have my break inside of my for loop and I run my code, you'll notice that it actually jumps down to here and then it breaks out of it. What happens if I put my break after this eval? I say, please guess the answer, and I hit 4, and you'll see here that it breaks my code. And essentially, wherever you are inside of your for loop or while loop in your loop here, it's going to break you out of that level into a new one. So not only does it break out of the try, it also breaks out of this for loop. Break statements are useful if you're encountering errors or issues, but usually to try and accept is kind of an alternative for it as well. This is the rand int, and that's the user input, and please experiment a bit more with the input as well. Awesome.